Kirk to Rayborn, report. I'm required to make a security confirmation. When I call my ship, if you list your personnel, cargo requirements, any special...
Star Trek built its reputation on optimism, exploration, and the idea that humanity could grow past its worst instincts. But not every episode fit neatly into that hopeful vision. Some stories went somewhere darker, somewhere bold enough that broadcasters around the world decided viewers simply shouldn't see them. Decades later, a handful of these episodes are still missing from certain broadcast rotations, quietly excluded the way a controversial chapter gets skipped in a reprint. Here's a look at 3 Star Trek episodes that pushed boundaries so hard, they're still treated as too much for some audiences, even today. Miri starts off feeling like a mystery, the kind of setup Star Trek did so well in its early seasons. The Enterprise picks up a distress signal from a planet that looks like a perfect mirror of Earth, and when Kirk, Spock, McCoy, and a small landing party beam down, they find a town frozen in eerie silence, like a 1960s American suburb that simply emptied out overnight. The quiet doesn't last. A disfigured man attacks the landing party before collapsing and dying in front of them, and shortly after, the crew encounters a frightened young girl named Miri. She refers to the crew as grups, her dismissive term for adults, and explains that she and a group of other children are the only survivors left on the planet, the onlys. Things take a darker turn when the crew notices strange markings developing on their own skin, the same symptom Miri says preceded the violent deaths of every adult on the planet. In an old lab, the away team uncovers the source of the nightmare. A life extension experiment had gone catastrophically wrong, unleashing a virus that wiped out the adult population while leaving the children alive, but trapped. The cruel twist is that these children are actually centuries old, aging at an almost imperceptible rate while remaining emotionally and psychologically like kids. As McCoy races to develop a cure, an older boy named John steals the crew's communicators, cutting off their access to the ship and pushing the situation toward chaos. Fear and jealousy eventually boil over into a full-blown mob, with the children turning on the landing party. Kirk manages to talk them down by appealing to their loyalty to the younger, more vulnerable kids among them, and McCoy ultimately tests the cure on himself before it's used to save the children. The episode aired on the BBC once in 1970, drew a wave of complaints over its disturbing subject matter, and was subsequently left out of UK repeat broadcasts for years. For a show that usually balanced its darker ideas with adventure and hope, Miri leaned hard into body horror and psychological dread, and that was apparently more than some broadcasters were willing to risk showing again. Few single moments in Star Trek history carry as much cultural weight as the kiss between Captain Kirk and Lieutenant Uhura in Plato's Stepchildren. In the episode, Kirk and Uhura are held captive by a society modeled on ancient Greek philosophy, and under the psychic control of their captors, the two officers are forced into physical contact that results in what's widely regarded as one of the first interracial kisses scripted for American television. Interestingly, NBC itself wasn't the network's biggest concern. Executives were far more worried about backlash from local affiliate stations in the Deep South, where racial attitudes at the time made such a scene potentially explosive. In the end, the anticipated wave of outrage largely didn't materialize. Complaints were minimal, suggesting American audiences were more ready for the moment than network executives had assumed. The reaction overseas told a different story. When the series eventually aired in the United Kingdom, the BBC chose not to broadcast Plato's Stepchildren at all. The network's official explanation cited excessive brutality elsewhere in the episode, but many observers at the time and since have suspected the real motivation was a desire to avoid controversy tied to the interracial kiss, dressed up in a more broadcast-friendly justification. Either way, the episode became one of the more conspicuous absences in the UK's Star Trek broadcast history, a quiet omission that spoke volumes. The darkest entry on this list takes the crew to Elba 2, a remote facility used by the Federation to house its most dangerous, criminally insane patients. What should have been a routine medical supply run turns into a nightmare when Kirk and Spock discover the asylum has effectively fallen under the control of one of its own inmates, Garth of Azar, once a celebrated and decorated Starfleet captain, now consumed by delusions of galactic conquest. Garth's condition is made far more dangerous by an ability he's acquired to shapeshift, allowing him to impersonate other people convincingly enough to manipulate everyone around him. He uses this power to torment Kirk and Spock psychologically, staging cruel mind games designed to break their resolve and assert his own twisted sense of superiority. In one particularly chilling moment, he murders a fellow inmate simply to demonstrate that he has the power to do so, a level of casual brutality that was unusually dark for the series. The tension peaks when Garth uses his shape-shifting ability to take on Kirk's exact appearance, leading Spock to use cold logic rather than appearances to figure out which Kirk is real before the situation spirals further out of control. The episode's mix of psychological torment, sudden violence, and unsettling instability led the BBC to determine that Whom Gods Destroy simply wasn't appropriate for younger audiences watching what was, at the time, often categorized as family-friendly science fiction. It remained one of the more notable absences from UK broadcast schedules for years, grouped together with other episodes the network considered too intense for general audiences. To understand why these episodes ruffled so many feathers, it helps to understand just how ambitious the franchise was from the very beginning. Gene Roddenberry created Star Trek as a single television series in 1966, and it eventually grew into one of the most recognizable science fiction universes ever produced, spanning multiple television series, a long-running film franchise, books, comics, and beyond.
The original series followed the crew of the USS Enterprise on a mission of exploration under the United Federation of Planets, built around the now iconic goal of seeking out new life and civilizations. Roddenberry drew from classic adventure storytelling and old television westerns, blending them with genuine science fiction ambition. Even though the original series only ran for 3 seasons before cancellation, its cultural footprint kept expanding for decades afterward, eventually leading to an animated series, 6 feature films with the original cast, and an entirely new wave of television series beginning with The Next Generation. What set Star Trek apart from typical science fiction adventure shows of its era was Roddenberry's deliberate use of distant planets and alien societies as a kind of disguise. By setting morally complicated stories in space, he found he could explore real-world issues like war, racism, and inequality without networks immediately recognizing just how pointed the commentary really was. The Vulcans, for instance, were written as a species that had once been defined by brutal aggression before choosing logic and self-discipline instead, a quiet allegory for humanity's own potential to outgrow its worst instincts. The United Federation of Planets itself functioned as an idealized stand-in for the United Nations, imagining a future where different worlds cooperated rather than warred with one another. This kind of social ambition didn't come without resistance. Network executives pushed back repeatedly on some of Roddenberry's choices, particularly his insistence on a multiracial crew aboard the Enterprise at a time when that kind of representation was still considered risky for mainstream television. He held his ground anyway, and that decision helped define the franchise's identity for generations. Star Trek's influence didn't stop at the edge of the screen. The franchise's now iconic phrase about boldly going where no one had gone before was adapted from language used in an earlier U.S. government booklet on space exploration produced in the wake of the Sputnik launch. The show's vision of handheld communication devices and mobile scanning technology is often cited as an early influence on the development of real mobile phones and digital mapping tools. Michael Jones, the chief technologist of Google Earth, has pointed to the tricorder's mapping capabilities as an inspiration behind Keyhole, the platform that eventually evolved into Google Earth. The franchise's reach extended into real institutional efforts as well. A contest launched in 2012 aimed at developing a real medical tricorder selected finalists in 2014, though no team fully satisfied the strict competition requirements. NASA itself acknowledged the franchise's cultural pull, naming a prototype Space Shuttle Enterprise in 1976 after a coordinated fan campaign. Star Trek also broke meaningful ground in representation, featuring a multiracial crew that included a Japanese helmsman, a Russian navigator, and Lieutenant Uhura, an African-American communications officer. Nichelle Nichols, who played Uhura, recounted that after telling Roddenberry she intended to leave the series, she encountered Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. at an NAACP function, where he told her, smiling, that Star Trek was the only program he allowed his own children to watch and that she was now part of history. Nichols went on to advocate for greater representation of women and people of color within the American space program, and NASA later approached her to help recruit astronauts for the Space Shuttle program, contributing to a more diverse generation of astronaut candidates. Even decades later, the franchise's cultural footprint kept surfacing in unexpected places. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the U.S. Vaccine Development Initiative was named Operation Warp Speed, a name suggested by Peter Marks, a self-described Star Trek fan who led the FDA division responsible for approving vaccines and treatments. The pattern of boundary-pushing storytelling continued well beyond the original series. The Empath, a third-season episode, relied almost entirely on suggestion and implication rather than graphic visuals, depicting alien captors subjecting the Enterprise crew to psychological torment and suffering. The episode's restraint made it more disturbing in some ways, leaving the worst details to the viewer's imagination. The BBC ultimately declined to air it for years, citing its unsettling themes of madness and suffering, and it remained one of the more conspicuously delayed episodes in UK broadcast history. The Next Generation had its own moment of shock value with Conspiracy, an episode centered on a parasitic alien threat infiltrating Starfleet. The episode's climax, involving a graphic practical effects sequence depicting a parasite's grotesque emergence from a host body, was intense enough that American broadcasters shifted its airtime to a later slot specifically to limit younger viewers' exposure, while the BBC opted not to air it domestically at all due to the visual intensity. Deep Space Nine contributed its own pair of boundary-testing episodes. Rejoined featured what was, at the time, a groundbreaking same-sex kiss between two female characters, a moment praised critically for its emotional sincerity but one that led some broadcasters in more conservative regions to edit the scene out entirely before airing. Meanwhile, To the Death became notable as one of the first Star Trek episodes edited specifically for excessive on-screen violence, with a particularly intense combat sequence trimmed down before certain broadcasts, including additional cuts required for UK airing standards. Despite, or perhaps because of, its willingness to push boundaries, Star Trek built an enduring legacy of critical and institutional recognition. The original series was nominated for the Hugo Award for Best Dramatic Presentation repeatedly during its run, with 3 of the 5 nominees in 1967 coming from the show, and all 5 nominees in 1968 being Star Trek episodes. The Next Generation continued that legacy with its own Hugo wins in the years that followed. The film franchise found similar success. Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home became one of the series' most commercially successful films, earning roughly $133 million globally against a modest $21 million budget, and it received 11 nominations at the Saturn Awards that year, tying with Aliens for the most nominations. The film also earned recognition at the Academy Awards across multiple technical categories.
Decades later, the franchise picked up its first competitive Academy Award when the 2009 reboot film won for Best Makeup and Hairstyling, proving the series could still impress industry voters well into a new era. Television honors followed a similar trajectory, including a Peabody Award for The Next Generation in the late 1980s, and a broader Peabody Institutional Award decades later honoring the franchise's overall cultural impact. In 2016, Guinness World Records formally recognized Star Trek as the most successful science fiction television franchise in history, a fitting capstone for a series that began as a relatively modest network gamble. Looking back, it's not surprising that a franchise this willing to challenge its audience occasionally produced episodes that broadcasters weren't ready to air. Star Trek never set out to be safe. It set out to ask uncomfortable questions, dramatize difficult truths, and occasionally show audiences things they weren't prepared to see. The episodes that ended up restricted or banned weren't failures of the show's vision. In many ways, they were proof of just how far that vision was willing to go. Decades later, these episodes remain fascinating not just for what got them pulled from broadcast schedules, but for what that censorship reveals about the eras that rejected them. Whether it's Mary's disturbing body horror, Plato's stepchildren's history-making kiss, or Whom Gods Destroys descent into psychological torment, each of these stories pushed Star Trek beyond comfortable television and into territory that still resonates with audiences today. What do you think? Which of these episodes surprised you the most, and do you think any of them deserve a second chance on modern broadcast schedules? Let us know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this deep dive into Star Trek's most controversial moments, make sure to like, subscribe, and check out more hidden stories from the franchise that continues to shock and inspire fans today.